Good evening. My name is Cinnamon Catlin-Gutko. I'm the director of the Illinois State Museum, and I thank you so much for joining us for tonight's conversation, Decolonizing Museum Practices. Before we begin, I want to do a little housekeeping. We're providing closed captions in Zoom tonight. You can turn on captions by clicking the closed caption button at the bottom of your screen, so please do that now if you need that service. But also feel free, anyone, to introduce yourself in the chat. The chat default is to all panelists, so if you would like other attendees to see your comment, please select all panelists and attendees. And we'll have time for questions at the end of the program, and you can send your questions by selecting the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen at any time during the program. We'll watch for them. We'll have about 15 minutes at the end to do that. My colleague, Sarah Davis, is joining us tonight, and she'll be watching that chat room, as well as the Q&A and providing backup for our tech services. So I'm grateful to have Sarah with us. And finally, we are recording tonight's program and making it available within the next few days on our YouTube channel. So be sure to check that out and share it with others. And as we start from my location today in Springfield, Illinois, I want to acknowledge that I'm on Peoria and Kickapoo ancestral lands. With respect to the people of the past and the present, I would also like to acknowledge the Indigenous communities who lived here during forced removal. There are more than 100,000 Indigenous people living in the state of Illinois today, and I encourage each of us to take time and research the Indigenous history and present of any location where you may live and work. Thank you for joining us again for this third in a 4-part series on social justice and museums. It's been an outstanding experience so far, great conversation and ideas, engaging audience members. We really appreciate this response. And our numbers are growing right now. I'm just watching the number tick at the bottom. It's wonderful. And you're helping us by joining us to imagine the future of the Illinois State Museum. You're becoming part of the process. I joined the ISM in September of 2019, and I've been moved by my teammates and their willingness to make inclusive change. We have a great deal of work to do as we grow, assess, understand, and adopt new museum practices. And with this conversation, it's my hope that audiences begin to hear and see what we're up to at the ISM, and of equal import, understand what museums around the world are doing to change and become more connected to the communities they want to serve. I'm super excited to have my colleagues joining me tonight, as I have with each conversation over the past few weeks. But this topic tonight is one that is very near to my heart, because before I was at the ISM, I was at the Abbey Museum in Bar Harbor, Maine, where we were very committed, and they're still committed, to understanding new ways of working with, by, and for Indigenous people, the Wabanaki in Maine. It was a transformational experience in more ways than one, and the women joining me tonight have been engaged in this thinking and work for so much longer than me, and they know deeply why this work needs to happen in museums and why it's critically overdue. So let's meet them. Joining me tonight are Andrea Carlson, Brandy McDonald, and Deborah Yepa Papan. Each will take a few minutes to introduce themselves and talk a little bit about their experience in social justice frameworks. And we'll start with Andrea, then Brandy, and then Deborah. So I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Bonjour, Nindanoe Malganidak, Andrea Carlson, Indigenous Cause, Kageasagek, an Indigenous Cause Minowa, Padawata Miaking, Nindunjaba, Idash, Gitcheo Nigaming, Ish Godangan, Mikanak Nindodem, Miigwech, Bisandawieg. So what I just said is introduced you to myself in Ojibwe. It's the language that I learned in college. And I think it's really important to hear Indigenous languages spoken. I'm on Potawatomi land. I am Grand Portage Ojibwe. I'm Turtle Clan. And that kind of gives you maybe a context if you know about Anishinaabe things. I'm also an artist, and I am constantly in spaces presenting my work in museums, which can be very antagonistic spaces. So I think that's part of why I'm part of this conversation, is my museum intervention work and work towards decolonization. Miigwech, thank you.
Leto Chokma Sanofa Brandy McDonald Chicasasea Chatasea. Hi, I'm Brandy McDonald. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation with ancestral ties to the Choctaw Nation. I am currently the director of Decolonizing initiatives at the Museum OS, formerly the San Diego Museum of Man. We just recently changed our name. Pronouns she, her. I'm also a PhD student at the University of California and San Diego in the Education Studies Department. So I'm maybe not go into too much detail because I think that some of the questions will, but I'm really passionate about decolonizing initiatives. I think what does it look like and what does it mean to start addressing the colonial practices that we see deeply embedded within museums and other nonprofits, that is just the colonial paradigm is systemic within our society. And so I think that that's kind of just like the space that I hold both in my professional life, but also thinking about within academia as well, and being a pracademic, both a practitioner and an academic, and where that fuses, and also just thinking about as an Indigenous person working and being in this field, both fields, academia and as a practitioner in the museum, like what does it look like being in spaces that weren't built for us, but we belong there. And so what does that look like and how do you navigate that? And I'm really honored and humbled to be with Deborah and Andrea and Cinnamon in this space, and that you all are here and like wanting to hear us as well and just be a part of the conversation, because I just admire both of their work. And yeah, so just being able to hold space with you all is really exciting too.
Well, thank you, Brandy. Thank you, Cinnamon, for the invitation to be a part of this conversation. I'm Deborah Yepo-Papan. I'm Jemez Pueblo and Korean. I'm a mother, wife, daughter, artist, Chicagoan. Although I consider myself a Chicagoan, I've lived here all of my life. I do acknowledge that I am a guest here because my people are from New Mexico and Korea. But I am here on Potawatomi home, and also home to Ojibwe and Odawa, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and other folks that have had relationships with this area here and with the lake. I'm the Native Community Engagement Coordinator at the Field Museum. I also serve on the Illinois Humanities Board, and along with Andrea, we both have worked together to advise and consult with other museums and organizations locally and around the country in helping them with their decolonization efforts. This is not work that I set out to do. This work kind of found me. I'm an artist. I'm a mother. I have worked in a community here in Chicago for many years. So my service has always been for Native people, and in particular for Native youth, and you know, trying to help create a better world for our people, for Native people. So that's always where I'm at. And so when I found work in the museum, a place that I never thought I would be at the Field Museum of all places, you know, as a Native person, having that opportunity to go in there and make changes, you know, is something that's really important for not just me, but for my daughter and my grandchildren, and for all Native youth. So, but thank you. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Great, thank you all. So as we launch into it, I want to bring in the words of Ho-Chunk scholar and friend to each of us, Amy Lonetree, who looks like just joined us for this session. She writes in her book, Decolonizing Museums, museums can be very painful sites for Native peoples as they are intimately tied to the colonization process. Unpacking this statement would take far more time than we have tonight, and also more emotional labor than I'd ever want to ask of each of you. For the purposes of framing up this conversation tonight, how would you characterize the history of museums, their creation, structure, and how it's caused harm? Brandy, could you start us off on that conversation?
Sure. sorry, it's my dog. He also is very passionate about the colonial paradigm of museums. So, sorry. I think that probably each of the panelists can talk to it, and so I don't want to hold too much space. But I think about the institution that I'm at, and then I think about even just the colonial legacy of all museums. Many of our museums, and vast majority of our museums, were founded through the colonial endeavor and have been benefactors of and contributors to the colonial endeavor. And even today, even organizations much like ours who are working towards decolonizing and recognizing that decolonizing is a verb, it's a practice, it's a process, it's a non-linear process, still replicate colonial harm intentionally and unintentionally. And so what does that look like? And so I think about it in the context and speaking from just the institution that I work at as an example. I like to talk about how museums are the classic. We love to take all your stuff, all your fancy stuff, become owners, become experts about those fancy stuff, put it on display, but not ask you about it because you're no longer an expert, because now we're the experts because we hold it. So we know how to take care of everything. We know how to talk about it. And erasing and detaching community members and creating this frozen piece in time, and also limiting the access of the community members who made the cultural resources, and limiting the access from their cultural resources that are representations of past, present, and future. Also, the extraction of cultural resources from community, the extraction of Indigenous bodies and cultural knowledge, and taking that ownership of the intellectual property of both tangible and intangible. So I'm gonna I'll just stop there because I know Deborah and Andrea probably have also things to say, and I don't want to hold up too much space, and I see y'all nodding.
Yeah, I think, the Field Museum is that same type of institution. It's 127 or 128 years old. It was founded, right after the World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition here in Chicago in 1893, where Native people were brought into Chicago for the World's Fair to basically be put on display. And then, sent home without their things. Their things were kept, and they were kept for the collection. And, I think that, that was all by design. It was to document who was here before, but also, it's part of that cultural genocide. You take all our stuff away from us, and then we don't have anything to sustain ourselves culturally, and yet we have, and we're here, and now we need our things back, and so that that's part of the hard part of that work of being in a museum, just knowing that there are so many things that are in storage that will never see the light of day, and could do so much better if they went back home and were among their relatives. And I also feel like that's also kind of kept us static in our traditions, that's kind of kept us from helping. I mean, where would we be if we didn't have all of our things taken from us, and we were allowed to, just kind of advance and let those traditions evolve and grow? What kinds of things would we be creating now? It's like, I feel like sometimes we're playing catch up, because now we're finally gaining that access back to, to our relatives and ancestors that are in these spaces. But yeah, it's just, there's so much work to do to undo over 100 years of, this legacy. But I'm glad that we're a part of that.
I guess I think that the harm that that Brandy and Deborah are describing, that is just in the very structure and bones of the institutions that I engage in as an artist. It's those harms are in how museum workers relate to one another, and the very structures of how communication happens within a museum. And then as a guest, as an outsider to those spaces, as an artist, I often kind of see a larger scope because every museum is different, but everyone thinks that they're doing kind of a standard museum practice. When it comes to these spaces, and the quote that Cinnamon led with, Amy Lontry's quote, is that these spaces can be hurtful when you know those histories, and when you carry those histories with you, when you know the harm that these institutions have done. And then if you're invited in as a contemporary Native artist, you relate to museums differently than non-Native artists. And throughout my career and in my academic training, every once in a while I would feel a little bit jealous, or a little I wanted to enter those spaces in an uncomplicated way. I wanted it to be, those museums to be those white box spaces where I would have full agency and I could create joy or whatever I wanted in those spaces without the burden of those histories and what actively is happening in those museums. So I think that as an artist, I've related to them differently. Museums have changed my work just because of how heavy the context is, and it's not necessarily fair. Decolonization for me is about healing, and we are invited into these spaces. Native people are invited into museums, and it's almost like we want to decolonize. We have a desire to decolonize while they are actively hurting us. We are expected to heal, and we're actively being hurt. If the harm could be reduced, maybe we could come towards decolonization, or move towards making museums less violent. But as it stands right now, they're very difficult spaces to heal in when they're still committed to harm. So I guess those are my initial kind of concepts around colonization and museums in the current moment.
Can I also jump in, if that's okay, Cinnamon? Because I
Absolutely.
think I just, in terms of really thinking about, one of the things that resonates with me is some of the words that our NAGPRA manager, cultural resources NAGPRA manager, says, Eva Trujillo. She's from the Kumeyaay community, and she really talks about, she's very passionate about her work in returning ancestors home, and also recognizing like the work we're doing in decolonizing initiatives, and the work and what museums stand for Indigenous people globally, it's painful, right? And like there is no way for museums to make it right. Like, we're not trying, you can't turn back time, you can't erase it and say, done, we're moving to equity work. It's really, and the way she puts it, it's about atoning for the wrongs. And I think that that's such a powerful, and that really resonates with me when she talks about like it's atonement, it's redressing colonial harm. And what does that look like, and how does it look like? And it's not forgetting the past, it's recognition, it's accountability. And Amy Lontry also like says, is thinking about some of the guiding principles that we do within our museum. But I think accountability is so much more than just like that one-shot situation and then we're moving on and we forget about it. Like, it's really, the atonement it's a long process. Trust takes a long process. And Indigenous people, we have a right to not trust museums. And we have, even if you've done some great stuff for the past 10 years, there's still like, should we really trust y'all? Like, because I think we see the ways in which the like oppression continues to be replicated.
Yeah, I think, as you know, along the lines of atonement, that a lot of museums, like, they don't think of themselves as like, if they think of themselves as like a living being or something, like, they need to do some self-reflection. And how many institutions actually do that kind of self-reflection and really look at its own past, its own legacy, its own faults, and admit them, make it public, talk about it. They don't, they don't talk about it openly. There's no transparency. And so, of course, like a person, when you bottle something up, it makes you ill. And so these places are sick places. And for Native people to try to work and exist within those types of spaces, it's so difficult. So, I mean, it's not just about collections and sending things back home. It's about changing everything and how those institutions work inside and how they work for Indigenous, Brown, and Black people that work there. And we need more of us in there, working in there to make those changes. And really, let's be real, I gotta say this, to really truly decolonize a museum, we have to burn it down. And then maybe build something different that's not a museum, but that's after we send everything home.
Thank you for that. You've really set me up for the next question that I want to hear. And each of you I know can respond to this. Absolutely. Well, let's start with Andrea. What does decolonizing practice look like? You've hinted at it, you know, you've said the things you'd like to see, but is there some practical descriptors you can provide? Maybe share a project that you found inspiring or motivational or something we could all learn from. And of course, I'd love to hear from all of you.
I like that. I'm getting very comfortable with the term the colonial practices. I like the idea of it as a process, and not. I feel like there are some people out there that want decolonization to be an end goal, like they want to be stamped as decolonized. You know, decolonize this place as though you can get to the other side of it, and then it's put in our rearview mirror or hindsighted. And I don't know, I think it needs to stay a process. I think it needs to stay in this space, because I'm nervous about foreclosing on Native healing. I'm nervous about this finish line that people are trying to get to decolonize, and we have to, you know, redress our histories, but also secure our futures. So I think it's really important to consider it a process and to consider it very community specific. I think when I was talking earlier to Deborah and Brandy, we were talking about how prescriptive some decolonial, like we don't want to like hand over a prescription, like do this list of things, and then you can emerge on the other side as the decolonized butterfly. We want to be very careful that we don't do that, because it is very community specific. It is, and also, like we were talking earlier about like the history of museums. Museums have different histories that need to, and they have different economies. They have, if you follow the money, there are different harms that some of them have. So one size, you know, doesn't fit all either. But there are some things that are very pattern-like. Colonization has these patterns. It has tactics to colonize people. You know, like we see divide and conquer all the time being happening in museums where you know, a museum might go to experts abroad or further places and not address the actual land that they're on, or you might see you know, a number of different colonial tactics being used. Museums, a lot of museum collections that are ethnographic, they started Native American objects and things entered those museums under the assumption that we were going to die. We were brought in because for posterity reasons. They saw animals, passenger pigeons being killed and animals going extinct, and that was that colonial mindset towards Native people, that we were going to all be killed off. So they bought up our things, put our things in their curio cabinets, but they were buying futures in our genocide. These things will have value when they're no longer being practiced. These things will have value when the people are assimilated, because there will be this little snippet in time. So I think that when you look at museum collections, sometimes you can see the old desires of museums. You can see that they were setting us up for failure, and they were setting us up for posterity. So those are things that that I think museum collection people that are in museums are you know, starting to become more and more aware of, and to make sure that they don't like continue that past tensing of Native people and continue to put like what is considered authentic in the past. So those are some initial thoughts. I might have talked too long.
Brandy, I'm wondering if you'd like to share a little bit about the work you're doing at San Diego Museum of Us around decolonizing practice. Give us some descriptors to add to this.
Yeah, and I think what Andrea was saying is really spot on. Like thinking about it's not a one size fit all. Everyone doesn't wear the same shoes. And then also is what does it look like to do a deep dive and really lean into like the legacy of your institution? Because I think that's going to, and also who's your home community, that's going to dictate kind of where you need to go and like what you need to do and the ways that you need to start working and what is the top priority based upon the community's wants and needs and their realities. Because it's not just this linear process that you write a grant, you get the money, and then you're done when the deliverables are achieved. Like, that's not how this works. The community is always going to be there. Our wants and needs are consistently changing because I like to talk about how colonization, there's this matrix and like you're consistently navigating, and when you adjust one way, it also is coming back in another way because it's thinking like, how does it continue to maintain that power and privilege that it's just established within the systemic system? And so I think about it in terms of like with the museum. I struggle sometimes with the San Diego Museum Act because that's not what we're a museum of us. So it's I go back and forth. So please forgive me if I make that mistake. But one of the things that I think in terms of the work at the museum that I'm at is thinking about whose ancestral homeland do we live on? That's the Kumeyaay Nation, and they're a sovereign entity. They are continuing to steward the land, and they're gracious, and we have done terrible things to them as the museum has done terrible things, and they are gracious enough to continue to work with us and give us their guidance and help us with repatriation and with policy. And just with the level of grace that they continue to show up with the history and the ways that we've perpetrated harm to them. And so I think that that has led a lot of our work in terms of access and thinking about repatriation and the way that our cultural stewardship of cultural resources and ancestors, and also doing a deep dive into the holdings. So we have 75,000 ethnographic items from across the world because it's a cultural anthropology museum. And so thinking about, it's not just a one-shot umbrella in terms of decol. And so one of the things that we did was really dive into Amy Lonetree's work and look at some guiding principles. So that way there's some parameters for what decolonizing initiatives means for this organization, but also fluid enough to where if we're working with the Maasai community, that these protocols and these guiding principles can still be applied, but their wants and needs may be different than the Kumeyaay or the Lakota or the Chickasaw, or like thinking about the indigenous communities of the Philippines, and what does it look like for making sure that we're honoring ancestors the way that different communities want their ancestors to be honored and stewarded until they go home, or if they go, they want them to go home. And so that's kind of thinking about the shifting so just in terms of maybe guiding principles before I stop talking, if that's okay, is we have kind of 4 guiding principles. That's truth-telling and accountability, and then rethinking museum ownership in terms of indigenous intellectual property, tangible and intangible, and then changing systems and policies. And so when we think about policy change, or at least when I'm working around policy writing, it's really recognizing that policy is great because it's pretty little language and it can say institutional, but if you don't do that cultural and structural shift, then they're just pretty words. Or if you do the cultural and structural shift, but you don't have the policy back it up, it's not this systemic, like a sustainable movement that they'll just dissipate. And so making sure that structure is the same and culture is the same as the policy. And then also representation is BIPOC representation at all levels of decision making is also imperative.
Well, Deborah, I'm wondering if this is a good segue to talk a little bit about your work more at the field. You've told us a little bit of an introduction, but I think I'd like to know, and our audience would like to know, a little bit more about how the change was started at the Native Halls at the Field Museum. Give us a little context and maybe what your hopes are for where it goes.
Wow, that's a loaded question. Well, I like to say, like, I kicked the door in and I forced my way in. It didn't really happen that way, but, you know, we do have to credit the curator of North American Anthropology, Ala Kawali, at the Field Museum, because, you know, she invited Native artists, contemporary Native artists, to exhibit at the Field Museum. And I think that was when, you know, that really helped that shift. And you know, being an artist myself, you know, I always believe that, you know, art is a catalyst for change. And so, you know, then my husband, I introduced Alika to my husband, artist Chris Papan. And, you know, then he was given an opportunity to exhibit his work there. And when that invitation came to him, we were both like, ew, at the Field Museum, gross. But we saw the challenge. We saw that as a great opportunity to get in there and help change the narrative and bring in authentic Native voice. And so because Chris's show, once it went up in 2016, we were spending a lot of time there because we were bringing Native people in. So I was doing Native community engagement before I was even a volunteer, before I was even hired to be on staff. We were bringing Native people in to see his exhibition. And so, that turned into that perfect opportunity to just then volunteer my time and help Alika with, making sure that we have more Native people that can connect with collections, and also help, in just, sharing their perspective, their voices, their thoughts, their ideas on, how we should be changing the Native American exhibition. And so after funds reached a certain point, funds were already in process of being raised to renovate the hall. And once they reached a certain point, they were able to hire me on as the community engagement coordinator. And so my work continues to this day in, making sure that Native people have a different experience when they come into this institution. Because as Brandy said, Native people, we don't trust museums like the Field Museum because of all the harm and violence that they've committed toward us. So there's that kind of intimidation also in walking into the Field Museum, which is, it's huge, and it can be intimidating. And so I think because, my Pueblo and Korean in me, I have this hospitality that, I bring to, to my work when I greet Native people to come to the museum. I buy them lunch, I buy them coffee. I spend my time with Native people, and we talk. And we talk about those harms. We talk about, how problematic those exhibitions are. We talk about the legacy of the museum. And we talk about ways that we want to see the institution change. And so I'm also just very deeply involved with the renovation process itself. And I've been helping to introduce, many of our Native collaborators, a lot of artists, contemporary artists that we are working with to help bring in their pieces, contemporary pieces, and to tell their stories in our new exhibition. And at the same time, I'm doing work that it's not within my purview, but as a Native person, I have to speak up when I see things going on in the museum, when I see somebody using an image that is just, stereotypical, still framing Native people in the past. My accountability is to Native people and Native community. And so I feel like I have to say something. And if I don't, I feel like I'm doing a disservice to Native people. So it's hard for me to say. I think the first thing I would like is, my position is term. My term ends when our exhibition opens. So I think, having a permanent position would be very important. And I would, enjoy, doing this work further. It's hard for me to say how I want to see this place change because I'm so embedded in what needs to be done now to really think that far in the future for that institution. But I definitely would love to see more Native people working there. I'd love to see all the cultural exhibitions change and be updated. And I'd love to see more community engagement with other communities as well. So yeah, I think that's a whole other seminar or symposium. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, and I'd just say too, while we're specifically talking about the field, it's a hope for all museums, right? What you've described is what we, I think, would like to see, and what you've described and well with your stories. and your experiences. I want to bring in the artist perspective more into this too, because you've already heard it in the way folks have been talking about museum work, in that art and artistry and the view of an artist really informs interpretation in museum spaces quite a bit, whether it's a historical interpretation or whether it's working with contemporary artists. Art shows up in museum spaces and gets attached to Indigenous identity and perspectives quite quickly. And maybe it stops there, maybe it takes a strange turn, but it's important to hear from artists and how they do this work. And so that's why I'm so glad to especially have Deborah and Andrea here. Andrea, maybe you could speak to this. You know, how do these tensions we've described show up in your work, your creative process, or not? Or how does it move you to places or drives you? How would you characterize it?
I think, well, so one thing well, it's you know, it's something that I think about, so it ends up in my work. I try not to make work that responds so much to when I've been hurt or what I'm carrying around, but it winds up in my work because it's something that matters. So it's so important to my communities. I did a project back in 2016, and we actually screened this film that I had made for the Minneapolis Institute of Arts on November 10, 2016. So it was 2 days after the 2016 election, and now I'm speaking to you 2 days after a presidential election. And it was really interesting because the project was called LUT, an act of reverse incorporation. And what I had done was made these kind of monstrous recreations of museum objects and filmed this grand procession out of the museum, where community members in Minneapolis carried these objects out of the museum, and we buried them in the yard. And then maybe 15 of we called them stakeholders, but the various community members rewrote the didactics and wall texts throughout the museum, just various, and it included poetry in the African collection. It was the first time the museum had ever had Black Lives Matter within the wall text. Artist Gregory Rose wrote this really beautiful poem about his ancestors' things, this power figure that was displayed behind plexiglass. And he made this analogy between his ancestors being stolen from Africa and brought to the United States, but also this power figure brought from the Congo to the United States and then displayed captive under glass when it was supposed to be protector of the community. And in his poem, he said, you know, Black lives all over the world matter. And the curator came up to me at one point, and who was a white man, and said, you know, I never thought to put those words in this space, and it takes artists sometimes to make that very clear. And then, so each of the contributors for the wall text then read their contributions, and then that was the soundtrack to the film. And so we had screened it, and it was a full house when we screened it, because I think everyone was hurting after that election, and they just wanted to be around people, and you know, came to Indigenous people to this presentation. I'd also like to say that one of the tactics that artists use when it comes to museum interventions is this refusing or denying museums things. I know in Chris Papin's intervention at the Field Museum, there's display cases that weren't able to move, and he had these decals over the spaces that would shroud things that shouldn't have been on display, you know, through his intervention. And not to tell on Deborah or Emily Johnson, who is in the comments, who's just a fabulous artist. Deborah is a really amazing accomplice at the Field Museum for intervention. Deborah and Emily went in before the museum opened, and Emily took some electric tape and covered the word Eskimo. I said it, but the E word throughout the museum, because that's still on display at the Field Museum, and that covering it up and refusing that word is just such a beautiful gesture, and I know Emily had been up all night working on one of her performances in Chicago, and then when she left, wrote why she had done that in a statement that Deborah printed out and put on display. So I think that sometimes these gestures, these even if it's like the act of putting tape over a name is so important, and it's seemingly so radical and so felt, and that the museums have just kind of gone on as business as usual for so long without even internally questioning some of these things. It takes artists sometimes to break things.
Deborah, I wonder if you want to jump in with your artist eye and artist heart.
Well, I guess, sadly, because of the work that I'm doing, it takes up a lot of my energy and my brain. So my art practice has actually taken a back seat, and so I haven't really created anything new, and I don't really do interventions with my work in museum spaces. I like to say I'm the intervention at the museum. I'm the artist who's the intervention, and I think helping Emily carry out her intervention. I really love to refer to that as our guerrilla intervention. I have the means. I guess I'm implicating myself here, but that's what we do when we are in these spaces as Native people. If we have the means and we can open that gate to let people in, to share their voices that they wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity, we need to take those risks sometimes. I know that was taking a risk, but to me, what's the bigger offense? Is that the bigger offense, or is the bigger offense that the E word has been on display for decades and nothing's been done about it? That to me is the bigger offense. So, that's as far as I go. I will find opportunities like that. But I won't announce them here. They'll happen. So yeah, that's how I view my role as an artist working in this position at the Field Museum.
That's great, thank you. We are almost to the moment where we start answering questions. The time has flown by, but I want to squeak one in before we do that. And usually I try to, kind of position into future space as we end these conversations, and I can't quite with this question, but I hope that it creates some provocations for participants. I know as museum practitioners thinking and doing the work around decolonization, we hear a lot of requests and inquiries around land acknowledgement. And it shows up in different places and different spaces. And I would say that even at museum conferences, for example, it's shown up just recently. It's not been a big conversation in museum conferences, much less museum spaces. So it's almost been overnight in our world. And can you speak, any one of you, maybe let's start with Brandy, talk a little bit about why land acknowledgement is important, but also how it gets misused, how it can be problematic when museums only focus on developing that or go about it in interesting ways. What's your reflection on land acknowledgements?
So I think land acknowledgements are incredibly important because you're on all of us are on Indigenous land. All of us are on Indigenous land. Indigenous folks have been displaced, dispossessed, cultural genocide in order for our organizations to operate and thrive and to make money off and to hold our cultural resources in our ancestors' bodies. And so we need to acknowledge the folks who have had to pay the price for our organizations to be here. And acknowledge that they're still here and they're still living, and many communities are still here and still living and thriving and producing, and culture bearers and tradition is still continuing to thrive. And so I think that that's really important, but I think that I also it goes back to words. I'm like, words are great, and I'm a big word nerd, and I like love a nice fancy 4-syllable word too. And I also recognize that words are hollow unless they're backed up by action. And many times land acknowledgements is that space where we're just like, we're talking about the deliverables and we're done. It's a checkbox where organizations like, yo, we got a land acknowledgement on the wall. We're great. And that's, you're not decolonizing. Like it can be an entry point. It can be a tool for education. It can be a space to start building trust with tribes and communities because you've messed up for so long and not like acknowledge that we exist and erased our existence and our voices and our realities. And yet it's not it. Like there's so much more that needs, and there needs to be a commitment to back it up. And I think their action and looking deep, and I like to think about it. I really love Lee Patel's work, who does decolonizing educational research, and just thinking about what it looks like. The pause is so powerful, and it's not pause to take a holiday and a vacation and go eat boba, but it's like a pause to like really sit and reflect and to lean in, to think about the ways that you replicate colonial harm. And no land acknowledgement, you're replicating colonial harm. But what are the other ways? Because it's dominoes. There's so much more in this fancy building that you have and the cultural resources that you hold. And it's thinking about the ways that you've done that, I think is where we're missing it. That's not the only, that there's so many more points to it. And sometimes maybe if the land acknowledgement is hard for, this is it, but if the land acknowledgement is really hard for y'all's organization and people are freaking out because, or having anxiety around it because that's based in fear, then what else do you, like, there's other places you're replicating colonial harm, y'all. So like, let's start addressing some of those spaces and then seeing how that can build up to land acknowledgement, because there's lots of entry points to doing this work. And in land acknowledgement, I think that sometimes people are like, that's the first and only, but there's so many ways that people are hurting Indigenous folks globally, and Black Indigenous people of color colonization has affected.
Yeah, so I hosted a land acknowledgement conversation on Indigenous Peoples Day with 3 other friends and colleagues, and it's available on the Field Museum YouTube page. So yeah, I mean, we had a conversation about, you know, exactly all of those things, and just, you know, just how complex land acknowledgements can be, and just because you make one doesn't mean that you're decolonized and you've done all the work. It's just one step in the bigger process, and it's something that should be evolving. So there are a few conferences that I had been to, and they were anthropology conferences. And I was so disappointed that they had no land acknowledgements anywhere, like not in their, you know, their pamphlets, not said anywhere publicly. And I was like, wow, okay, but I'm not surprised, anthropologists. So, you know, and I think that's the other thing with land acknowledgements too, is that, you know, sometimes as Native people, we're disappointed when we hear like really bad land acknowledgements. And sometimes we wish that people wouldn't make them at all, but then we get mad when they don't make one. So, I mean, definitely, you know, that should be a step in a much bigger, you know, process, and really just, you know, it should open that door to begin having conversations. And I think Chicago and Illinois are really hard though, because we have no reservations in Illinois. We don't have any, you know, Native land bases. Native people were pushed out. So I wonder, you know, and by treaties. So, you know, maybe acknowledging treaties too, acknowledging, you know, sovereignty, and, you know, land back is a huge part of, you know, what can institutions do to actually give land back to Native people, and especially here in Illinois, so that we bring those people back to their home, where they can really, truly call this home and take care of their home. They do it much better than we can, because it's you know, they've always done it.
Yeah, everything they said and more. I always quote Heather Miller, the director of the American Indian Center in Chicago. She told our mayor, who wanted a land acknowledgement for City Hall, she said, yeah, a land acknowledgement is the very least you could do for us. And I always think of that, it's the very least. Recently, the Blackhawks hockey team announced that they are going to start doing a land acknowledgement before every game. that is incendiary. That is so maddening when they have a Native mascot, when we have a not your mascot movement, for them to use a land acknowledgement like that. That is violent towards our community. And I will just like stop with that because I get a little hot.
No, I think I appreciate your connection to this moment right now. Like this is breaking news right now. And I hope all of the folks on tonight will, activate and watch and intervene when they see it used inappropriately, or encourage for it to be developed, or at least find new starting points. So I appreciate that. It's really good. We have lots of questions, so I would like to move into that, and they are kind of gelling around some key themes. So I'm gonna kind of squish them up a little bit to get them through our conversation. We have quite a few questions rolling in around how do folks who are maybe just entering the museum field, emerging professionals, maybe they're at that true entry-level place in a museum, and they know something needs to happen and they can't figure out how to affect change, or how should they start affecting change in the position that they have in the museum space? What advice would you give that entry-level emerging professional or middle management even that gets trapped and needs to make change happen? What can they do? Who'd like to go? Brandy, you want to try?
I feel like I hold too much space when I go first. So I think that there's a lot of, we all hold a lot of power, and we're also constricted with some of the positions that we're in. Even if you're in a director role, there are a lot of barriers and parameters pushed and set around what you can and can't do because of the power of systemic racism and colonization and the colonial endeavor. And the construct of, well, this is best practices for museums, and whose best practices. So I think in terms of like what I would say is, I think is also look and see kind of we're stronger when we start working together to create change. And who is who are your folks? Who are the network of support that you can start working with? Because I think that that's really powerful, is to start thinking about like finding some of these spaces where if you collectively work together, then you can start making it, and it's a snowball. You can start creating public programs, or you can start thinking about, if you're in charge of curriculum development, engaging in the community. If you're thinking of cultural resources and cultural resources management, you're in charge of stewarding cultural resources. So what does that really look like? And how are you stewarding cultural resources? And so I think there's a lot of power in that and support. And there's also, this work is hard, and to be like, I think we've heard like from both, like all of us, it's not necessarily cupcakes all the time. And to be really trained, I cry a lot. And I think like without the support, like even just connecting with Andrea and Deborah, like I just think like without their support and the support of the industry, and reaching out to folks that don't even work within my organization and being like, do you all see this too? Am I alone? Has been really powerful. And that's what I would also say is like engage in these conversations with people that's maybe not even in your institution, because sometimes you can talk it out and talk it through and be like, what should I do? And they have the ways that they've started to like crack away at that oppression wall. Because I think there's a lot of like, even if you're working for a natural history museum, there's a lot of similarities in the way that colonization replicates itself. And there's a lot of ways in the ways that we start to crack away at that and carve space so that the next folks, or so that even just in like, we get to a phase 5 versus like maybe we're at a phase 2 right now. But if we pushed for a 10, it would break, and the relationship would break. But maybe we can push for a 5. And words are also really powerful, like thinking about the words that we use and how words replicate harm.
Deborah, Andrea, want to chime in?
I think that was perfect.
Look at you.
My like kind of entry point into museum studies was through James Luna. He died in 2018, but through his artifact piece and how he, used contemporary art to really challenge a space. I know that as an artist, I've actually, it's not always easy to challenge a museum. They are going to be the space that is going to offer you career opportunities and all of those things as well. And I have seen colleagues get punished or blacklisted for challenging a museum. So it's not easy work for artists or outsiders to challenge museums and those power structures. It's actually, sometimes it hurts our career and it follows our careers. I've also noticed, like, when that scaffold piece went up, the Sam Durant piece at the Walker Art Center, that the people, that the artists and women who were primarily protesting it, oftentimes museums like the Walker will look past that group that has protested it, and they're like, yeah, we need Native inclusion. They'll look past the group that was protesting it to find some Native who wasn't tainted by the controversy. And I've seen that happen. I've been a beneficiary of not being part of some protests because I wasn't living in Minneapolis in that part, and then the Walker acquired my work, you know, and where I question, I wasn't at that protest. Am I the untainted Native that they're including for show? You know, I've seen that, but I've also been part of protests and then have been kind of blacklisted from my involvement. So I want to say, like, if you're in a museum and you care about these things, watch out for who is getting punished for their decolonial work, or for their, at least their activism.
That's really great advice. So
Yeah, sorry, just as
go ahead.
also, because I think it's like, look like what I think in that terms too is also like, what is the power and privilege that you hold because of the position that you are in? And so like leverage that power and position and show up for those folks, and to, like, use your voice, use that power and privilege. Like, I think about the position that I am, and I also fully recognize, like, phenotypically I am light skinned, and like, what does that look like for being passing, and the power and privilege that holds in the space, and what does that mean for, like, how can I support my community by recognizing that, but also leveraging that to, like, continue to move the work forward and make space for community members and pass the mic.
So we have a cluster of questions that speak to NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection Repatriation Act, which is 30 years old this year, and monumental legislation. There are still museum workers who don't even know what NAGPRA is, which astounds and mystifies. And of course, with that kind of descriptor, we still have resistance to compliance in museums. And so folks are kind of asking, how do you observe NAGPRA and museums, especially here in Illinois? What needs to happen? What would you like to see happen? What is mystifying you about the process? Some of those kinds of questions are coming in. Andrea or Deborah, maybe specifically, since we're in Illinois.
Deborah and I do these things where we team up. I'm always telling people that we're kind of like a set. We come as a pair. And recently, you know, we were advising a museum together, and you know, we have to ask every museum now, how many bodies do you have? And we almost assume a positive, like, so how many of our ancestors do you have in your collection? We have to ask these things. And I don't know, I know that Illinois State Museum has quite a few of our ancestors. So it is one of those very hurtful things, but we have to kind of, that's where we are kind of upfront with NAGPRA. I think it's so important to remember how NAGPRA was argued when it was being, like, their treaty rights aren't just like Native rights. Treaty rights are settler rights as well. They're also, that kind of codifies that relationship. There are no treaties that give settlers the right to enter our graves and dig up our ancestors. There are no treaties that allow for settlers to grave rob. Your rights are not allowed within. So I think a lot of people think we can do whatever we want to the land because it's ceded, or it's because it's ours now. That is not true. That is not rights that are reserved for settlers to ever enter our graves, and that's something that people need to remember. That it is you know, when you think of treaties being the highest law of the land, that all of this other stuff is just window dressing. But that is the ultimate relationship, that you don't have that right. So I think about that a lot. I think about about all of these violations. I think it's really interesting when people talk. I always tell this story. I was with some friends out in Salem, Massachusetts, doing some research, and we left the hotel. There's Leanne Howe and Susan Power, they're writers. And when we left, we were talking to the concierge, and we said, what should we do? We have a free day. Where should we go in Salem? And he said, we have in this town the second oldest cemetery in the United States. And he didn't realize he was talking to the 3 Native women. And when we left, I was laughing, like none of us was gonna get that. Like none of us was brave enough to fight this kid. And so I turned to Leanne and I was like, what do you mean the second oldest grave? These settlers have the second oldest grave? And Leanne turned to me and she said, Andrea, our graves aren't graves. Our graves are archaeological sites. And it just like blew my mind. Like, oh my God, that's exactly how they think.
Yeah, I went to the Repatriation conference last week. Was that last week?
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, because I'm still learning. I don't know everything about, you know, NAGPRA and how, you know, that's supposed to work. And I feel, you know, it's awful that I can't learn from my own institution, you know, what it's all about. And, you know, I feel like, you know, institutions I know were scared when NAGPRA was put into law, because they still to this day have this fear that we're all going to come rushing in and take everything back, and then they're just not going to be a museum anymore. They're not going to have anything. You know, dinosaur bones are just not enough for them. They need to have our things. And so, you know, I feel like, you know, it's like a dirty little secret that, you know, some of these institutions, you know, that they keep, that because they're not transparent about, you know, how many items they have or how many people they have. That's part of the hardest thing about going to work, is that knowing that there's the possibility that my own ancestors' bones are in collections. And, you know, that's something that people don't understand. Who else goes to work where potentially your ancestors are in the basement in a box, mixed in with other bodies possibly? You know, that, and that's why I go to work. That's why I'm still there. As many times as I've said, I just can't do this anymore, and I cry in my office, or, you know, I'm hurt, or I'm putting up with whatever, you know, colonial BS. It's because I have to be there for my ancestors, but they need to go home.
And I also say, I know that I'm not in Chicago, but can I talk about NAGPRA? So, okay,
Sure.
I don't want to take up space, but I do, and I also think what, like what y'all are saying, yes, like our ancestors didn't consent to being there, like, and that I think is like is also a really important factor. Is like, what does that look? Our cultural resources, like we didn't consent to them being there, and so like that I think is at the heart of a lot of some of the things. It's not that they donated their body to be like chilling in our museums. And a lot of the ancestors with grave robbing and they were just taken, and pieces of ancestors. And because I think about the cultural resources and the ancestors that we hold 7,500 ancestors at the museum that I'm at. And what does that look like for the amount of ancestors that were taken from their space that unconsensually? And I think under the guise of research and under the guise of like being and preserving and protecting and the disappearing Indians all over the world. And so I think that that's important. And then I also just wanted to add a couple things in terms of NAGPRA. I think we as institutions can do better at NAGPRA, because I think that NAGPRA, while it's this great piece of like legislation, it also is incredibly restricting, and it privileges the museums. It privileges the universities and the institutions. It doesn't necessarily privilege Indigenous folks. Like we have to work really hard to get our cultural resources and our ancestors back. And so what does that look like as institutions if we're really talking about decolonizing initiatives and being ethical and equitable? Like we need to acknowledge oral tradition and do cultural stewardship and not have Indigenous folks pay for their boxes for their ancestors to be repatriated back to them. Like that's like these, what does that look like? And what does it look like to ask for consent before we take notes in different consultings, and make sure that the Indigenous people want to be alone with their ancestors or their cultural resources, then let us be alone with our ancestors. We haven't been connected to them for like however long since you like displaced them. And so I think that that's really important, is really examining the ways that you're still replicating colonial harm, even in your NAGPRA processes.
I know for one, I could keep going for hours. And I am always better after I've spent time with each of you. So I am grateful for you joining us tonight for this conversation. That will be one in my memory banks for a long time. So thank you. I want to wrap us up and just say that we have one more great program that we are offering on November 19th, same time, same place, 6 p.m., Museums and Community Engagement. And we'll be hearing from Melanie Adams, who's the director at the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum in DC, Dina Bailey, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Mountaintop Vision and has been working with the Illinois State Museum on its inclusion initiatives, and Donna Sack, who is the Vice President and Chief Program Officer at NAGPRA Settlement in Naperville, Illinois. So I hope you will join us. Visit illinoisstatemuseum.org to sign up. I am very accessible. You will find my email address on that website. If you have follow-up questions, because I didn't even get close to all of them, I'm open and ready to answer, or at least try to get you an answer from someone who knows better than me. All right, well, good night to everyone. Be well, take care, and thank you for joining us.